Okay, well, I hope everyone's feeling well fed, rested, conversed, whatever else. We've had the technical problems in the morning, now we've had wasp problems, but I think we've managed to get rid of it without too much screaming and screeching. So, welcome back to the afternoon. Excuse me. I'm really pleased to introduce Caroline Gatrell to you. Caroline is a Professor of Organisation Studies at University of Liverpool, and both myself and Ben have worked, well, in the same institution as Caroline in the past. Have you? I don't know whether you have. There's Lancaster connections there anyway, so which is really nice. Her research is focused on issues to do with work, family and health, and she's published widely both in sociology and management journals. Of particular interest to us here is her work on how working parents, both mothers and fathers, manage boundaries between paid work and their everyday lives. Her work, as I'm sure you will find or will already know, is extremely relevant, and that's why she's had sort of great success with engaging with public policy partners, some of whom are here today, so Working Families, the Equality and Human Rights Commission over there. So we've put this event together for you, Caroline, and I hope you're very appreciative of that. And I'm so pleased that Caroline has agreed to come along and talk to us today. Her presentation is titled Parents, Perceptions and Belonging, Exploring Flexible Working Among UK Fathers and Mothers. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. I am really pleased to be here. It's just a great opportunity to talk about the things that we're all interested in. And on a day like this, I think, oh yes, this is why I'm a scholar, this is why I'm an academic, this is what it's all for. And so it is lovely to be here in such good company. So Emma asked me to talk kind of based around a paper that was published a couple of years ago called Parents, Perceptions and Belonging, which is what I will do. And I'll talk a little bit about some data, a bit of context in terms of how men experience fatherhood and work and relationships between parenting, work and gender, and a little bit about family practices. And then I'm going to talk a bit about how I am theorising about the data that we've drawn upon. And it's some ideas about why, really, despite policy initiatives and campaigns and lobbying and research, why it still seems to be so difficult for fathers to access flexible working or shared parental leave or whatever policy initiative it is. So I'm going to refer initially to some research which I was at the point of doing the research at Lancaster University, I'm now at Liverpool, which we did jointly with Working Families, which was funded by the lottery. The purpose was understanding the relationship between flexible working and paternal well-being. And we wanted to understand more about how today's fathers experience work-life balance and family lives. How easily did they access flexible working? And also whether or not working flexibly actually enhanced employee engagement among fathers. And that was about relationships with employers, because we felt if we want employers to prioritise flexible working, they've got to understand why it's important. And we thought it might be that actually our research will show that if you offer flexible working to your employees, that will actually enhance their commitment to you as an organisation. So that would be a good reason for doing it. So we had both a quantitative and a qualitative element to this research. So there was an online quantitative survey, which was looking at fathers, work-life balance, working and stress. We looked at two UK organisations, one public and one private sector, both of which on paper at least had very good flexible working options. And we surveyed just over 1,000 fathers, and then we did qualitative interviews with 100 dads. And in terms of what we found out quantitatively, we found that flexible working fathers did seem to have better relationships with colleagues. They weren't necessarily more engaged with their organisations. That was perhaps more noticeable for dads who are working in the private sector, because for them it was more of a privilege and less of a right or an entitlement. Public sector dads were used to working in an organisation where this was part of what you do, so it was a little bit more taken for granted. But certainly those who had actually managed to access flexible working did have a sense that the organisation was committed to them. So there were some benefits for the relationship. We found one or two interesting things, which I'm just going to mention, things that were surprising to us. So we found that after the first child, fathers were stressed. Their stress levels went up. And we had imagined that stress levels would go up again after the birth of the second child, and then again with subsequent children. And that didn't happen. We found that stress levels went up after the birth of the first child. Then after the birth of the second child, they levelled off. And then when third child or more came along, they went back up again. And in the qualitative interviews, we asked about that. And fathers said, well, actually, when you have child number one, everything changes. So there might be more pressure financially. It might well be that if you've got a partner who's in paid work, there might be a possibility that they are going to downshift what they do. You've got this feeling of being responsible for a new baby, and that's all new, and it makes you very anxious. You might have to expend money. There might be a need for a new car or kit for the baby, so it's worrying. When number two comes along, you kind of know you can do it. You've got a confidence. You think, all right, this is all right. The financial situation probably doesn't change that much. The partner, if they're still at work, probably stays at work, and the kit that you've got probably do. The car will be all right. When number three comes along, then it becomes stressful, because it's quite likely that if you've got a partner, they might drop out of the workplace altogether. So the dads that we spoke to were saying, oh gosh, I'm responsible for it all now. And things that would do with two children, like your car, probably won't do. You might even have to look at moving house or feel very crushed in the place that you are. So that was one thing. Doing housework enhanced men's well-being. This was interesting, and when we talked to men, we think the reason why this was the case was because they had a better work-life balance if they contributed to housework in the household, and they felt that their relationships with partners were probably better. I was interested this morning that we didn't really talk much about housework, and the research that I've done with women actually looks rather different from this. When I talk to women who are in heterosexual relationships with children, the housework is often the big bone of contention, because mothers tend to feel, actually, it's still left to me. We might share the income earning, we might share the childcare, there's incentive for us both to want to be engaged and involved with our children, but when it comes to the really drossy, run-of-the-mill, non-rewarding stuff, that's the bit that I get stuck with, and it's the dilemma of either living in a complete mess, which I find very stressful, or constant arguments with my partner if they're in the relationship to get it done. And even post-divorce, there's still often an issue that the non-rewarding, non-direct things that you have to do for childcare tend to land with the woman. So we found that among lower paid workers, flexibility gave a greater sense of control in their working lives. That relates to overall well-being, and we found that fathers who work flexibly were likely to have better physical and psychological health, both in the public and the private sector, if they could access flexible working. They engaged in healthier behaviours, and there was less sickness absence. So from the perspective of the organisations, really, there were huge benefits in fathers taking up the flexible working that they offered. And the offer was relatively generous. There were lots of options that men could access. However, really outstanding, whether they were offered it and accessed it or whether they couldn't access, most fathers felt discouraged from taking up flexible working. So if they did it, it was a bit of a battle, and there were any number of men who sought to access it but just couldn't get in there. They found that they were really discouraged. So in our qualitative interviews, we sought to find out, well, why should that be? The organisations are offering it. They claim that they want it to be available. the research evidence shows that things like sickness absence will drop. So why is it that fathers feel discouraged? Oh. I don't know why. Right. So one of the key themes that came out was that dads believed that flexible work-life balance policies, which were in theory offered to parents, were in practice aimed only really at mothers. And men had a perception that women had a better deal. I'm saying this is rose-coloured because in the research that I do among women, I've not seen anything to suggest that women actually find it easy to access flexible working, or that it's easy to manage it, or that it's easy to manage your career or workplace trajectory when you're working flexibly. But I think it would be fair to say that management practices and behaviours didn't appear to be aligned with family needs. And they didn't seem to recognise the complexities and change around family and work, paternal circumstance, and the need or desire for flexibility. So, just a few examples. This is Matt, who found it very difficult to actually access the flexible working that was on offer. He said, the issue we're trying to deal with, my daughter, there's no real recognition of the fact that I'm a father. I'm just seen basically as a male rather than a father and a parent. And so he made a little business case, but there was no consideration paid to it. It was ignored, and he said, I found that really damning on the part of the employer. James, my employer views fathers less seriously as parents than mothers. There's an inbuilt perception that the mother is the main parent. And Brick asked for a period of unpaid leave to look after children, and yeah, he got it, but it raised eyebrows. He still thinks that mothers have the positive image as carers. You might say, well, this would be predictable, wouldn't it? But in our qualitative interviews, we had a preponderance of single dads that put themselves forward, and some gay dads who put themselves forward to talk about the difficulties of managing this flexible working if actually there is no female partner in the background. Or if there is, you might still have to be responsible for some of the childcare. Being recognised as a single parent father is difficult. People look at you as if you've grown two heads, like, but where's the mother? Etc. It takes a bit of explaining. I'm on my own. You don't get the same. You don't get the same as single mothers. They seem to have the advantage. You're just supposed to accept that dads don't get the same focus. Flexibility isn't seen for the dads. And that made us start to think around what we mean by family. And we draw upon the work of David Morgan, which I think is very helpful, this notion of family practices, that the whole concept of doing family has changed and continues to change. And that even if organisational policies might recognise this, organisational practices and cultures don't necessarily recognise that family practices have changed. So it might well be, for example, that you have a father who's involved because the partner is absent. So Nick is actually doing everything and working out his school day, and one of the kids is not well, so he's got to fit in medicine alongside that, and there's only him doing it. Rob was sharing care with his parents. His son lived with him full-time since he was 4. I'm fortunate, my parents are retired and they help me out. I have some lengthy journeys to get to work, and they help me out with regard to after school. He might sleep round with them, so it allows me to leave any time in the morning as I want. And a nice example from Sol, who is saying, you know, actually things are quite amicable between me and my ex-partner. We live close and we sort it out between us. So she's their mum, but if she's working nights, they stay with me and I have them. It's not official, we never married or anything, so it's just shared. And I think what the fathers were saying and what we deduced from this is that the idea of how family is done still seems to be located in some kind of, if it ever existed, some mythical past where there are two parents in a home where one is female, one is male, and it's quite likely that the female will take the burden of the domestic care agenda. And even the way that statistics are collected, I would question, might perpetuate these myths. It's not very helpful. So with Sol, I don't know who it is that's supposed to be the parent of residence, but with any number of men that I've interviewed in this and indeed in other pieces of research, it might well be that there is a child who is supposed to reside with the mother, and that would fit in with the figures of, you know, only 1 in 10 single parent households is a man. There are lots of family situations and extended family situations when in fact it's just not that straightforward. So it might be that a man has children with him for 1 week during a month, or a week on and a week off. There are lots of family situations that are not necessarily reflected in organisational practices, and I don't think at this point that they are necessarily reflected very well in statistics, because when the form's filled in, what's the official answer might not actually relate to what's happening in practice. So if men are finding that they feel discouraged from accessing flexible working or shared parental leave or whatever it is they're seeking, that's highly problematic, because that's not actually reflecting how people are doing family at this time. It's not reflecting the complexities. It's not reflecting the possibility that what people are doing might not actually fit with the forms and the way that statistics are gathered and reported. And it might not reflect paternal desire to spend more time with children. So Mark was actually talking about the conflict really between his job and the opportunities that that presented him with, and his desire to spend more time with his children because of a wish to be part of their lives as they were growing up. My family is more important than my work, but I need my work to support my family. And my work, my income is very important to me. It's part of who I am. So he was kind of acknowledging that this breadwinner identity for fathers was very important to him. He didn't want to be a stay-at-home dad. But I'd never consider a job that means spending time away from them while they're so young. I just never consider it, so it's difficult. And he went on to talk a bit about the constraints that this had on any progress that he might make in terms of his job. And fathers are really ambivalent. So this is Proudmon who's saying, you know, there's a career cost of involved fathering. If I was to take promotion, there would be increased pressure on me. More things I have to do which might make it difficult to pick up kids from school. So that's my choice as to whether I want to prioritise the kids or get the benefits of promotioning. But it comes at a price. I worry about what I'm losing putting off promotion. And when I presented this to a group of women, they were like, well, welcome to our world. Now you know what this is like. Why would you think it was going to be so different for you? So I think there's also something about men as men in the workplace, viewed as workers, might be viewed in one particular way, but men who are actually presenting themselves in a workplace as child carers who are prioritising their family might actually find themselves put in the same classification as women who are working part-time or flexible hours to look after children. And interestingly, we had initially looked to see whether or not flexibility might enhance employee engagement, and we found a bit of a relationship, but not striking. But there was a very striking relationship between where flexibility seemed to be on offer, i.e. it was there on the website and the policies, but actually was not available in practice to individual fathers. This caused real resentment and disengagement. So I think that's a real kind of warning to organisations. You have to do this, and if you're going to do it, you have to follow it up. Oh, the organisation says lots about its equal opportunities and gender. I really don't see that, not from the ways that I've been treated. So that's the context. That's what the research told us. And now I'm just going to talk a bit about how I am theorising parents, parenting, and the notion of belonging as sort of based on these and other findings. So in looking at belonging, I've drawn on some work by Vanessa May. There's a reference at the end of this. And she looks at belonging as something that's both individual and social. Your relationship between yourself and society, both locally, your workplace, your family, your friends, and more broadly, what's happening in terms of policy and legislation. And she suggests that belonging might be dynamic. It might shift in keeping with social change. And looking at what Vanessa May does, we then looked at what I call a Parsonian view of households, which is very old-fashioned. Talcott Parsons was writing in the 60s and 70s. Lots of you will have read his work. And at the time that he was writing, the social situation was more in keeping than what he was writing than it is now, certainly among middle-class households. I think it's likely, well, it's certainly the case that he was looking at middle-class, affluent, probably white households when he made these assumptions, and there would be lots of working-class households where actually both parents would need to work just to keep the family going. But what Parsons did was to locate fathers and mothers, each in a separate category. So he assumed couple households to be heterosexual. He points out that divorce rates were low, they would have been at the time that he was writing. And he's looking at fathers as instrumental economic providers and mothers as expressive lead carers. And our argument is that although those particular classifications don't reflect what people are doing now, I'm not sure they did then, perhaps for certain groups, but they're very outdated. Nevertheless, what happens when parents want to do something like access flexible working or shared parental leave, they come up against these classifications because people are assuming or making assumptions about where they think that a man or a woman ought to belong. So somebody has to do, I think it was Matt did, to present a business case for why he should be able to access a particular family-friendly opportunity. And then I think you could extend that, or I am extending this, by looking at the classifications, the sort of boxes that men and women with children are put into, by also looking at the body. And I think the body is a really important aspect of organisations and organisational practices that's just starting to come into the management conversation, but is unlikely to be found in some of the really mainstream journals. And if it is, it'll be framed in language that's acceptable. It's very unusual to have certainly management discussions about the body and work, and yet they're really important. There's been more work done on mothers' bodies than there has on fathers' bodies, and I'm just going to talk a bit about the maternal body, what I term the maternal body, before I go on to talk about men. So the maternal body is a description that suggests that women's bodies are primarily associated with reproduction, with childbearing, nurturing, regardless of whether a woman does or doesn't have any children or whether she intends to have any children. Maternal bodies are associated with poor health. So in a medical context, the work of Sarah Nettleton, I think, explains this really nicely, that in a medical context, a man's body is seen as the norm, and women's bodies are presented in biomedical discussions as other. So men are seen as normally healthy in society, and the normally healthy male body can, of course, go wrong. People can be ill, but normally men are healthy, whereas women are presented in medical discourse as normally likely to have something wrong with them due to fertility or non-fertility, menstruation, the possibility that they might become pregnant, pregnancy, breastfeeding, post-childbearing years, the menopause. And once you start to get this idea in your head, if you just flick through something like WebMD, one of the health sites, it will be all about raging hormones and women's irrational behaviour. And I have argued that this discourse about women as unhealthy and tied into procreation spills over into organisational cultures and discourses about women. So yes, there is research that says if somebody takes maternity leave and they're out of the workplace for a bit, that might be something that disadvantages them because they are marginalised. But I'd argue that it goes beyond that. I'd argue that actually the organisational views about women as employees is constantly underpinned by things that are not necessarily verbalised, about fears that somebody might go off work because they might have a baby, the fact that somebody might not manage because they might have a baby. Sometimes these are spoken in whispers, sometimes not. And when I do research with women, it's still really striking. Some women are quite open about it, and some women say, well, I did a management seminar and I talked about all this, and it was very interesting because I was talking about pregnancy discrimination and the kinds of things that had happened to women when they announced pregnancy at work and how they'd been treated while they were pregnant. And in this setting, a number of people contested it, and they said, no, you're coming up with these really extreme cases. So, for example, somebody who came back to work after maternity leave and found that her office had disappeared, and she was in a broom cupboard, literally, and her stuff was just in boxes. And women who found that instead of being on all the exciting projects, they were given sort of very junior, dull roles, and they weren't part of the conversations that were going on. And people were saying, no, these are extreme cases. And then at the end of the seminar, a couple of people came up to me and somebody emailed and said, actually, that's happened to me. Do you think, would you like to interview me? So it's not spoken about, but it's there. Now, with men, according to Nettleton, men's bodies, in the medical sense, are regarded as normally healthy. They're associated with stability, and they're seen as distant from procreation. That's not to say that all men fit that description. So Raewyn Connell does some really interesting work about how problematic it is if you're a man and you've got this kind of expectation and you either can't or you don't want to fit in with that. So I'm not saying it's straightforward. But the discourse is that men are not going to disappear off and have babies, and it's very unlikely that they'll take parental leave. And so in terms of the workplace, this is hugely advantageous. There's a really famous management saying by Shine, think manager, think male. And Alison Pullen and Carl Rhodes have done lots of interesting work about the image of a male body in a suit in the workplace and how that's seen as the ideal, the fit. You don't have to convince somebody that you fit if you've got that kind of body. Although acknowledging it's very problematic for men who don't wish to fit or don't feel that they fit that image. So that's advantageous if you're a man in the workplace and you're thinking about your career. But if you turn that around the other way, what I would say is that it's highly problematic in relation to social ideas about belonging in terms of childcare and work-life balance. If organisational cultures and discourses are all about this idea of manly men and breadwinning and what you do, it becomes even more difficult. No wonder somebody has to write a business case when they want to actually make an argument for being able to spend a bit of time with their children. So it is a real issue. So the future. I think we've determined today, and research has determined, that it's not just about need. There are shifts in paternal desire to be involved fathers. So we need much more widely available flexible working, shared parental leave, lots of different options to allow men to share in engaging with children and children's upbringing. And we need more research on fathering and family practices, particularly among separated or divorced fathers, where fathering practices might be fluid and unpredictable. They won't necessarily fit a pattern if there is two of you and you don't live together and you're trying to raise a child between you. And there's lots of dependables, variables, previous and future partners, personal attitudes. And in terms of belonging, I think organisational policies probably are starting, particularly in some of the bigger organisations, to reflect social dynamism in family practices. But organisational behaviours are slow to catch up with these changes. So it's kind of not surprising that in terms of shared parental leave, line managers don't know, don't approve, we don't know what the policies are, we don't know the HR people don't necessarily how it works or how to access it. And I think there's still the case that parents are often classified by assumptions that are made about their gender, assumptions about their sexual orientation, assumptions that there must be somebody female in the background somewhere who will pick things up. So I'm going to sort of end with a quote from Beckham Beck, Gernsheim. It's a very old book from the Normal Chaos of Love, but I think it still has a lot to say because it, I think, it foresaw social changes, and those social changes are happening, but social practices are still a long way behind. So what they're saying is that for men, there has been a shift in the way that men regard their relationships with children. There's no such thing anymore as a job for life. Whatever level of the workplace you're at, whether you're on 0 hours contracts in a low-paid, low-skilled job, or whether you're actually somebody very senior, it's very unusual to be able to assume that you start your career and you nail your flag to the mast of an insurance company, whatever it is, and they're going to look after you, or a university, they will look after you and you'll leave with a good pension. That just isn't the case. So is it worth investing yourself in that? It's less likely that you will have a relationship for life than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago. So where's the relationship that you might want to invest in? What's the lifetime relationship? Well, it's the children. So partners come and go. The child stays and becomes the final alternative to loneliness, a bastion against the vanishing chances of loving and being loved by your partner or by your organisation. It's a private way of putting the magic back into life to make up for general disenchantment. Children have never been more important. That's an old quote, but I think it's very prescient and I think it's still very relevant now. So I'm going to end there, and I hope I haven't gone on too long.